Peppa was playing in her room when she noticed a strange box on the windowsill. Inside was a yellow toy with huge black eyes and an eerie smile. On the box was written, "LABUBU." Peppa was delighted and ran to show it to her mother. But Mummy Pig saw nothing in her daughter's hands. "Stop playing imaginary games," she said, and went to prepare dinner. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound. Tick, 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 as if someone was scratching the glass with claws. The sound grew louder and more insistent. A second window appeared in the room, dark as a void. Beyond it stretched a gloomy forest where the trees resembled elongated LABUBU figures with empty eyes and eerie smiles. Peppa screamed. Mummy rushed in and turned on the light. The window vanished. "You had a nightmare," Mummy reassured her. But when the light went out, the window appeared again. A whisper came from the darkness. "Soon you'll be home, Peppa. Soon you'll be one of us."
Peppa tried to throw away the LABUBU toy, but it always returned to her room. She tried to close the second window, but it appeared on other walls. "Mummy! Daddy! Help me!" she screamed. But her parents couldn't see LABUBU or hear his voice. To them, Peppa was just talking to herself. On the seventh night, the LABUBU army came right up to the window. There were so many of them that the forest glowed with the yellow light of their bodies and the black gleam of their eyes. In chorus, they chanted, "It's time, Peppa. Time to join us." Peppa looked at herself in the mirror. Her skin had turned completely yellow. Her eyes were big and black, and the same horrifying smile as LABUBU's appeared on her face. I'm ready," she said in a voice that now sounded like LABUBU's. The second window opened by itself. Cold wind from the LABUBU forest rushed into the room. Peppa, now looking more like a toy than a pig, stepped toward the window and disappeared into the night. In the morning, Mummy Pig came into Peppa's room to wake her up, but the bed was empty. On the windowsill lay only a small yellow LABUBU toy with big black eyes. "Peppa, Peppa, where are you?" Mummy called out. She picked up the toy. For a moment, it seemed like LABUBU winked at her and whispered quietly in a familiar voice, "I'm here, Mummy. I'll always be here." A week later, George found a strange toy in his room, a small yellow monster with big black eyes. And that same day, a second window appeared in his room. "Dinosaur! Dinosaur!" George exclaimed. "No, George, I'm LABUBU, and soon you'll be LABUBU too," the toy replied. In the forest beyond the window stood a figure that looked very much like Peppa, but with yellow skin and black eyes. She waved at George and smiled with LABUBU's horrifying smile. Be careful with toys that appear out of nowhere. Sometimes they don't come to be played with, but to turn you into a toy. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window, a second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky, mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees, watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. Everything's fine. No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest. Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. There's a wall, sweetie, she said. You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more. And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day, she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. You had another dream, darling, said Mummy. Everything's all right. But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. Who are you? She wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. You look out the window, but I'm inside. That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, it opens. Of drawings. It started on a quiet morning. Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was dragging something along the floor. In the hallway, she saw him carrying a cardboard box. Old, dusty, no writing on it. It looked like something forgotten in a basement. Where did you get that? Peppa asked. George didn't answer. He just smiled. He placed the box on the floor and opened it. Inside were drawings, dozens, some on torn scraps of paper, others fresh and colorful, all drawn by a child's hoof. Did you draw these? George stayed silent. The first drawing was simple. Peppa standing in the kitchen, a broken cup on the floor, Daddy with a broom, Mummy holding a rag. A few hours later, it happened, exactly like in the drawing, down to the smallest detail. Peppa dropped a cup, shards scattered. Daddy sighed. Mummy got the rag. Just a coincidence, Mummy said. But George pulled out the next drawing. It showed their garden, a ball stuck in the tree, Daddy holding a ladder, Peppa reaching up. The next day the ball really did get stuck, in the same place, exactly like the drawing. Peppa started going through the drawings. The further she went, the darker they became. The colors, duller. The figures, twisted. One showed Peppa's room at night. At the window, a silhouette. Faceless. Peppa shoved it to the bottom of the box. But that night she woke up, went to the window. For a moment, she thought someone had just stepped out of view. Another drawing, the bathroom, the mirror, Peppa's reflection smiling, even though she wasn't. Another one, George sleeping, and beside his bed stood a second George, identical, but with red crayon eyes. Peppa hid the box in the closet, but George found it again. He said, I have to keep watching. Every day, new drawings appeared, even though no one was drawing. One morning, at the very top of the pile, was a picture of that exact breakfast. The tablecloth, the cup, the toast, all correct. At the edge, a drop. Peppa thought it was paint, but it was tea. Then came a drawing of the living room. Daddy asleep in his chair, and behind him, someone reaching toward his shoulder. That evening, Daddy flinched. He said, I thought someone touched me. But the room was empty. At last, Peppa found the final drawing. It was black and white. It showed herself, standing alone in an empty room. No windows, no toys. Her face, blank, arms limp at her sides, and behind her, the box, and written in neat handwriting, "Now you're inside." That night, Peppa woke up. The room felt unusually dark, too quiet. On the floor, the box, empty. All the drawings were gone. Only one remained. It lay on top. It showed Mummy, Daddy, and George sitting at the table, smiling, laughing. But Peppa wasn't there, and at the bottom, written carefully, "They don't remember you anymore," in an old chest in the attic. A small figure with big dark eyes and a wide smile. It had a tag, LABUBU. The toy was soft but cold to the touch, as if it had been kept in a freezer for a long time. "Can I take it to my room?" Peppa asked Mummy Pig. "Of course, dear. But wash it first, it's very dusty." Peppa took LABUBU to her room and placed it on the shelf next to her other toys. The toy stared straight ahead with an unmoving gaze. Something about its smile seemed wrong, too wide for such a small face. At night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound, quiet rustling, as if someone was crawling on the floor. She turned on the nightlight and looked around the room. Everything was in its place, but LABUBU had disappeared from the shelf. "Where is it?" Peppa muttered, getting out of bed. She found the toy under the bed, lying on its side. Strange! How could it have gotten there? Peppa picked up LABUBU and put it back on the shelf. The toy seemed heavier than before, and its smile had become even wider. The next day, Peppa was playing with George in the living room. Suddenly, she heard the patter of little feet upstairs. "Mummy, someone's walking in my room," Peppa said. "There's no one there, dear. Maybe it's mice." But when Peppa went up to her room, LABUBU was not on the shelf again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the room, turned toward the door. Its pose was as if it had been waiting for Peppa. "How did you get here?" Peppa whispered, carefully approaching the toy. LABUBU was silent, but its eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. The girl quickly grabbed the toy and put it back on the shelf, but this time turned it to face the wall. At night, the rustling repeated, but now it was louder. Peppa woke up and saw that LABUBU was standing by her bed, looking straight at her. In the darkness, its eyes glowed with a faint greenish light. "What do you want from me?" Peppa whispered, not daring to move. The toy didn't answer, but slowly raised one hand, as if it wanted to touch Peppa. The girl screamed and turned on the light. LABUBU instantly became an ordinary toy lying on the floor. "Mummy! Daddy! What happened?" asked Mummy Pig, running into the room. "LABUBU! It was moving! It was standing by my bed! It's just a toy, dear! It can't move!" But Peppa saw the truth in LABUBU's dark eyes. The next day, she tried to throw the toy away, but it kept returning to her room. First in the trash can, then in the garden, even when Peppa took it to the neighbors. LABUBU always found its way back. It began appearing in the most unexpected places. In Peppa's school bag, in the refrigerator, even in the bathroom. Each time its smile became wider and its eyes brighter. One night, Peppa woke up and found that all her toys had lined up in a row, looking at the bed. And in the center stood LABUBU, like a commander of an army. "Now you understand," whispered a voice that seemed to come from all the toys at once. "I'm not just a toy, I'm a collector. And now you're part of my collection." Peppa wanted to scream but couldn't move. Her body was becoming stiffer, like a toy. She felt her skin turning to plastic and her thoughts slowing down. "Don't worry," said LABUBU, coming closer. "Being a toy isn't so bad. You'll play forever. With me." In the morning, Mummy Pig found a new toy in Peppa's room, very similar to her daughter. It stood on the shelf next to LABUBU, with the same wide smile and motionless gaze. "Strange, I don't remember buying this toy," Mummy Pig muttered, adjusting the little dress of the toy Peppa. and LABUBU stood nearby, its smile even wider. Now it had a friend, forever. But LABUBU's collection wasn't complete yet. In the evening, it heard George playing in the next room. It was time to find a new friend. Peppa woke up in complete darkness. No sound, no glimmer of light, as if the world had vanished. She looked around, but George wasn't there. The house was silent, and even the walls felt unfamiliar. Peppa's hoof touched George's toy dinosaur on the floor, but George himself seemed to have dissolved into nothing. The window, which usually opened onto the garden and street, now showed only a black void, dense and bottomless. She carefully approached the door. The floorboards creaked too loudly, though she could usually walk without a sound. Her heart pounded, her breath grew unsteady. When she stepped into the hallway, it felt as if something in the dark was watching her. The walls seemed alive. Strange shadows rippled across their surface, shadows that shouldn't have been there. "George!" Peppa called, but the only reply was her own voice echoing back at her, as if the house had too many empty rooms. She took a few steps toward the stairs, and just then, the lamp above her flickered. Light flared, then instantly died. But in that moment, Peppa saw a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, distorted, as though stretched out of the darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and from its mouth came a strange, low sound, an echoing, broken melody. "Tongue! Tongue! Saha!" the figure hissed. Peppa froze. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. Her heart stopped. Her mouth went dry. The creature lifted its hand and stepped forward. The floor groaned beneath it, but the footsteps sounded as if they came from several places at once. Peppa instinctively closed her eyes and pressed her ears with her hooves, but the melody only grew louder. She could hear it inside her head now, along with a whisper, "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button below the video, or he'll come for you too." Peppa opened her eyes and screamed. The creature was closer now. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its face was too long, its mouth stretched too wide, and its eyes burned brighter and brighter red. She backed away, but the hallway grew longer. Each step didn't bring her closer to her room, but instead dragged her deeper into the house. Doors on either side opened on their own, and from each came the same whisper, "Tongue, tongue, Saha." Peppa ran to her parents' room and pushed the door open, desperate for safety. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, belongings carefully placed, as if her parents had never lived there. On the wall mirror, she saw not herself, but George. He stood motionless, his eyes hollow, his mouth moving, repeating the creature's words. Peppa stumbled back in horror. The mirror cracked, and George from the reflection stepped forward, trying to emerge. The girl screamed and bolted into the hall. Lights flickered everywhere, and each time they lit, the silhouette of Tung Tung Sahur appeared. Sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside her. She burst into the living room. The television switched on by itself, showing only static, and from the speakers came the same melody. On the screen flashed her own face, twisted, foreign. Its lips moved, and it spoke. "You cannot escape." Peppa clamped her hooves over her ears, shut her eyes, pressed against the wall. But the sound only grew stronger. The air thickened around her, and every shadow in the room began to shift, stretching toward the center. The creature slowly emerged from the darkness. Its hands reached for Peppa, fingers too long, bent like hooks. It tilted its head, and its mouth split into a grin filled with alien, inhuman joy. "Tonight will not end," Tung Tung Sahur intoned. His voice echoed from the TV, from the mirror, from the shadows themselves. Peppa screamed, but her voice drowned in the roaring melody. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The world quaked around her, walls pulling apart and closing again, the ceiling rising higher. turning the house into an endless maze. The last thing she saw were the creature's burning red eyes. They loomed closer and closer until they filled her vision completely. And then came darkness, silence, and a whisper, faint but clear. "She's ours now." The morning began like any other. The sun slowly rose over the pig family's house, its rays passing through the green walls of the living room, leaving familiar shadows on the orange sofa. Daddy Pig had already turned on the TV, Mummy Pig was washing the dishes, and Peppa and George were just waking up. But something wasn't right. Peppa opened her eyes and immediately felt an unusual silence. The house seemed to have stopped breathing. The air was thick and heavy, like before a storm. There were no familiar sounds, no footsteps, no birds outside, only a distant humming, like a faint electric buzz. She sat up in bed. George was sleeping peacefully, but even his breathing sounded too steady, too artificial. Peppa stood up and walked to the door. The floor felt cold beneath her hooves, and every step echoed softly. The hallway looked familiar, but the light was strange, dull and cloudy, as if the walls were swallowing the sunlight. When she went downstairs, her heart froze. Her whole family was already sitting at the table. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George. Bowls of porridge sat in front of them, untouched. None of them moved. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Their eyes were wide open, gleaming with an unnatural light, and their smiles looked drawn on, too wide, too perfect. "Good morning," Peppa said quietly. No one replied. Daddy Pig slowly turned his head. The motion was sharp, jerky, like a puppet on a string. "Good morning, Peppa," he said in a flat, muffled tone. Peppa flinched. At that moment, the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showing static. The sound of white noise filled the room. Peppa stepped closer. The image began to clear. On the screen was her, but the reflection moved differently. It lagged behind slightly, then froze and suddenly waved. Peppa didn't move. The reflection smiled, first faintly, then wider and wider, until the mouth stretched too far, distorting the shape of her face. The TV hissed, and a distorted voice spoke backward. The words were garbled, but Peppa somehow felt it was speaking to her. She pressed the remote. Nothing happened. She changed the channels. All of them showed the same thing. Her face, smiling, silent. She backed away toward the table. Mummy Pig and George were now looking at her. Their smiles didn't fade. Their eyes moved in perfect unison, following her every step. George's toy dinosaur sat on the table. Its plastic eyes blinked. Peppa screamed and ran upstairs. The staircase seemed to stretch under her feet, her steps echoing louder than usual. The house repeated every sound, as if breathing with her. Her bedroom was dark, even though the sun still shone outside. Peppa approached the mirror. In the reflection stood herself, but not quite. Her fur looked darker, her eyes hollow, and her mouth stretched in an unnatural grin. The reflection slowly placed its hooves against the glass from the inside. The surface fogged up, as if it were breathing. "Who are you?" Peppa whispered. No answer, only a faint crackling sound, like the TV's static, filled the room again. Peppa stepped closer. Her reflection copied the movement, slightly delayed, like a broken recording. And then, in perfect sync. Both Peppas pressed their hooves to the glass. For a moment, the house froze. Then a familiar voice echoed from below. "Peppa, breakfast's ready." She stumbled back. The room brightened. The laughter of her family floated up from downstairs, soft, cheerful. Everything looked normal again. Peppa took a deep breath, trying to convince herself it had all been a dream. She opened the door and went down. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George were sitting at the table, smiling and lively. "Good morning, Peppa," they said together. Peppa sat down but didn't answer. There was something wrong with their voices. Too smooth, too even, as if they were speaking in rhythm. She glanced at the window. The sunlight shone as always, but her reflection moved a second later. And when Peppa blinked, the reflection didn't. On an ordinary evening in Peppa Pig's cozy home, as the sun had set behind the horizon, the twilight deepened and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. Inside the house, everything was peaceful. Mummy Pig was putting away things in the kitchen. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper in the living room. In the children's bedroom, Peppa and her younger brother George were getting ready for bed. They were laughing, sharing toys, and everything felt just like any other night. But their peace was interrupted by a strange sound. From under the wooden floor of their bedroom came a scratching noise. It wasn't the usual rustling of mice or the creak of old boards. The sounds were rhythmic, as if something was scratching the wood with long claws, pausing and then repeating. Peppa and George froze. Their little hearts were beating faster, in sync with the eerie scraping sound. "Did you hear that?" whispered Peppa. George nodded, clutching his pillow tighter. They tried to stay still, listening for any other noises. The scratching faded, then returned, growing closer each time. It felt as if some invisible creature was slowly moving beneath their bedroom. Night had fully descended when Peppa suddenly woke up. The room was filled with absolute, dead silence, which was far more terrifying than any sound. Then she heard it. Muffled, heavy footsteps, as if something huge and invisible was walking directly under them. Each step echoed like a dull thud. After that, a low knock followed, then a deep, intermittent breathing, filling the room with icy air. Peppa cautiously shook George. He sleepily opened his eyes but immediately widened them when he heard a new sound, the slow creak of wood. One of the old floorboards slowly lifted. Peppa held her breath. Two long, unnaturally thin limbs, black as charred wood, emerged from beneath it. They looked like twisted branches of an ancient tree but moved too consciously and deliberately. The deer monster's hands slowly groped the surface of the floor, every motion graceful, almost elegant. The children watched in terror as the fingers slid across the wood, as though searching for a gap to grasp and crawl out. George squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the blanket. Peppa, trembling, couldn't tear her eyes away. It seemed as though the black fingers lingered by her bed, as if sensing her breath. In an instant, the hands disappeared as quietly as they had appeared. The board lowered back into place, and the room sank into silence again. But on the floor remained dark, sticky marks like traces of resin. "Mummy!" George exhaled, his voice so faint that Peppa barely heard him. They didn't dare call for their parents. It felt like making even the slightest sound would bring the hands back. Peppa and George sat together, holding each other tightly, waiting. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house made them flinch. Just before dawn, when the first light filtered through the curtains, Peppa dared to get out of bed. Where the hands had moved during the night, the floorboard was damp and cold. Faint, dark prints were visible, thin lines like patterns of branches leading deeper into the crack. Peppa looked up and noticed a new crack in the wall. It stretched upwards, as if the tree was trying to break into the room. George approached her, and they froze. From the crack came a faint, barely audible whisper. The deer monster had returned to the darkness of the crawl space, but it had not left. It was waiting. It all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her. But the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual, a walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the third day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the fourth day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all, but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms, but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the seventh day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light, without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it. A monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalelo Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. Dancing, laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was Lirili Larila. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalelo Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Lirili Larilla's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next.